Thursday, but voting here in France started on Saturday. Among those here who get a say in shaping Algeria's political future are many people who believe it's time for Abdelaziz Bouteflika to move on. Some joining together to campaign against the president's re-election, and they hope to make an impact far beyond this poll. Pauline Godard and Kitevan Gorgistani report.
This is the rally of shame. It's the rally of national treason.
Protesters gathered in front of a Paris hotel where supporters of the aging Algerian president were meeting. Abdelaziz Bouteflika is running for a fourth term. That's one too many for the opposition, which is calling for change.
We want to make our voices heard. We don't want this corrupt leadership. We don't want these elections that are bringing back and recycling a sick man. A man with a very negative record in power. Look at what they've done. There's absolutely nothing left.
Inside, there were a few hundred Bouteflika supporters and two of his ministers. As one of them was addressing the crowd, he was interrupted by protesters. The protest was short-lived as security quickly escorted them outside of the building. These young Algerians and Franco-Algerians set up their movement called Civil Action for Algeria back in February. They're still looking for office space, but their goal is to make an impact.
I realize this country deserves much more. It has wealth, it has everything. It has young people within reach, but they're all leaving the country.
Their movement is trying to mobilize all generations of Algerians in France and in Algeria in order to move forward.
For this awakening to happen, we have to call on all Algerians to get together and from there create an active civil society that will guarantee a democratic process. Then, existing political parties will have to bring an alternative. Only a constructive debate will allow us to build the Algeria of tomorrow.
The opposition knows it must unite. 4 parties have already joined forces to coordinate a national boycott campaign. They protest together and see themselves as an extension of their counterparts back in Algeria. But they want to take things further by teaming up with non-political organizations.
The reason we're insisting on civil society is that many Algerians don't belong to a political party. So, if there are well-known figures in this coordination, Algerians will want to join, and then we can make a difference.
On Saturday, members of the 4 parties protested outside polling stations as France's Algerians cast their ballots on the first day of early voting for their country's presidential elections.
France's Algerian community, as well as Algerians in Algeria, are protesting against this fourth term and voicing their desire for change. A change in the system, a radical and peaceful change that will establish the rule of law and protect people's freedoms.
We're here to reassure the people, to reject the system as a whole, with all its clans, because they all have the same goals. Our goal is to have a political transition and a real constitution that will give the Algerian people its sovereignty back.
Other groups gathered in front of the Algerian embassy in Paris, a protest organized by a brand new movement called Bara, which means out.
Activists in Algeria and France are here for a peaceful fight. It's all peaceful. We want to change things peacefully. We take to the streets peacefully. We're not vandals. We don't want to destabilize the country.
Salah Menia, the Masira group spokesperson, also joined the protest.
Refusing to follow the regime's schedule is the first step in mobilizing Algerians in Algeria and abroad. Members of the Algerian diaspora are deeply attached to their country, to the legacy of Algeria's struggles, and to what is going on in their country. We know that mobilizing and building alternatives are long-term battles.
Staging more protests, holding more meetings, and making their voices heard. Algeria's civil society abroad is developing the means to be more efficient and is determined to make things change. Their battle has just begun and will continue long after the April 17th election.
Now, for more on Algeria's presidential election, I'm joined on set by William Jordan, who was America's Deputy Chief of Mission in Algeria from 2009 to 2011. Hello, thank you very much for coming in.
My pleasure.
Now, following on from that report, I'd like to start off by talking about people voting in the election from here, from France. Do you think that on the whole, they'll end up voting along the same lines as people back home in Algeria?
My impression is that the voting here will probably follow exactly the lines there. In other words, there will be a strong pro-regime or pro-Bouteflika vote. There will be a large number of people, like the folks we saw in this report, who will be pushing for abstention or possibly voting for other candidates in order to manifest some sort of real opposition to Bouteflika and the regime. But I don't think that the vote here will be heavily tilted or decisive one way or the other. Again, there are so many questions in the absence of polling, in the absence of any real way to measure opinion for this vote, to know how it's going to break down.
Now, Bouteflika, after 15 years in power, he's the favourite to win this election. How do you explain that he's still so popular, especially when he hasn't really engaged with the public in a very long time?
Bouteflika has never engaged very much with the public, at least not in the way that we think in the West about how a president needs to sort of maintain contact. He's been somewhat withdrawn for many years now, and it's important to remember that even though he suffered this health crisis in last year with the mini stroke, he also had a serious health crisis even earlier, 2005, 2006. That in many ways sapped his energy, and you could almost say from that time he stopped making regular visits around the country. He stopped having regular speeches and began putting off more and more of the sort of ceremonial activities that would put him out in front. So I think that in many ways the estimation or the assessment of Bouteflika has more to do with what he did to bring Algeria back from the dark days of the 1990s with the terrorism that was rampant then, and the degree to which he has represented a certain amount of stability and has, I would argue, advanced a certain amount of restoration of civilian rule of law in the country.
Now, since some of his support comes from the fact that he helped end the civil war, do you think that there is a clean divide between young voters and the older generation? That perhaps we might see more younger people rebelling and voting against or abstaining?
I see the division as being a little different. I don't think there's a young-old schism, because I think that actually a lot of the opposition to Bouteflika, a lot of the Barakat leaders are arguing. It's hard to call them young people. I think there are young people in that movement, but I think a lot of the leaders, a lot of the people who are trying to make a difference in mobilizing civil society are actually of an older generation than the age group that is largely unemployed, dissatisfied, and feels rather alienated from the government. Instead, what you have, I think, is a real challenge for anybody, whether they are pro or anti-regime, of mobilizing what is a large disaffected group of young people who I don't think see in any of the alternatives offered currently a project or a way forward to changing the country in a meaningful way that is going to bring them the jobs, the housing, the opportunities that are fundamental to them.
So considering those problems, do you think that in some way the focus on Bouteflika's health has perhaps taken attention away from some of the more essential issues, and perhaps because we don't actually know what his state of health is right now, It's maybe not as bad as people say and he is actually fit to govern?
I think the health issue has been a distraction, but it's been an obvious distraction given the severity of the stroke that he had, which was sufficient to cause him to remain in France for a long period of convalescence. But inasmuch as I think that, as in almost any country where you have a well-developed presidency, it's not just one man, but it is the group around Bouteflika, the group around the president, that ultimately makes the difference. He has a very effective team. His former prime minister, who is currently acting as his campaign manager and who will probably recapture the prime ministry after the election, Abdelmalek Salal, I think has been a firm and decisive leader and has acted very much in keeping with what Bouteflika wants. So yes, I think there's been a distraction. The problem has been that in the absence of any real engagement on the project for a future Algeria, other than potentially empty words, all you can really focus on is the man, his health, and whether he's capable of governing.
Do you think he and his entourage have been rattled at all by the former Prime Minister, Ali Ben Fliss, running? Because apparently he is the closest challenger.
I think that Ben Fliss is not surprisingly the most potent candidate out there opposed to Bouteflika. Given the fact that he ran in 2004, he has experience of this, and he has managed, I think, because of the distance from that last almost humiliating defeat in 2004, he's had a chance to try to reinvent himself. Again, I think that Ben Fliss's most potent force right now is that in the absence of any other credible challenger to Bouteflika, those people who don't feel that abstaining or boycotting the vote is really the solution could rally around Ben Fliss and actually vote for him. And who knows? I mean, I think the election is pretty much a foregone conclusion. But any election always holds the possibility of a major surprise. Ben Fliss is the only person who could really do it. But the reality, I think, to a lot of Algerians is that even if Ben Fliss is a different face, he is neither a serious generational change from Bouteflika. He's only about 8 years younger than Bouteflika. He is also, in terms of being a creature of the establishment from which Bouteflika came, has to raise a lot of questions about exactly what sort of a program of change Ben Fliss has in mind.
Because that's the thing, change is always mentioned, or in many electoral campaigns, it's all about change. But perhaps people in Algeria, some wanting change and some perhaps seeing countries in the region, the Arab Spring, and how change can actually be quite difficult. So maybe they're afraid of change, do you think?
I think that change, like democracy, unfortunately, the Western approach to dealing with the Arab world in terms of its problems of governance has emphasized democracy. And democracy, even in the Arab world, I think to a great extent, and I would count Algeria among this, is sort of a value or an idea or ideal that to which people aspire. But the reality of it is not necessarily something that people fully understand. And again, when you talk about change, when you talk about a difference, alternatives in Algeria, people want something other than the status quo. But when you actually begin to lay down for them what that status quo could mean and the risks that would be entailed in that, I think people start to back up because, of course, changing the status quo is fine as long as your status quo or what you have isn't called into question. And that's going to be the real challenge and the real problem for Algeria going forward.
Okay, thank you very much, William Jordan, for coming in to us here at France 24. That's it for Focus. We're going to go to a short break now, then I'll have the headlines for you, including reports of Ukrainian forces in the east of the country switching sides. Several combat vehicles have been spotted with Russian flags. Stay tuned for that and plenty more.